They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. Mine didn't. I just saw the smug, entitled faces of my classmates laughing as my future burned. In my past life, I ruined myself trying to save them from a scam. They rewarded me with absolute betrayal. Now I'm back. The calendar on the wall says it's exactly 3 weeks before the most important deadline of our lives. This time, I'm buying the popcorn. Let them sink. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the sterile chemical stench of the hospital room where I took my last breath. It was the distinct, suffocating mixture of cheap body spray, floor wax, and stale corn chips. I blinked. The blinding fluorescent lights of the classroom buzzed above me like angry hornets. My cheek was pressed against the cold faux wood grain of a high school desk. I sat up my lungs, pulling in a sharp, desperate breath. My hands clamped onto the edge of the desk knuckles, turning white. I was alive. I wasn't 32, broken and blacklisted. I was 18 again. The calendar pinned next to the chalkboard read October 4th. A heavy, suffocating silence wrapped around my brain as the memories crashed into me. October 4th, the day it all started. At the front of the room stood Serena. She looked exactly as she had in my nightmares. Immaculate blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, wearing a designer sweater that cost more than my family's monthly grocery budget. She was holding up a glossy, tri-fold brochure, her smile perfectly practiced, radiating a manufactured warmth that had half the room utterly captivated. "It's not just a vacation, guys." Serena purred her voice, dripping with earnestness. "It's a networking opportunity. The Oceanic Vanguard is a luxury liner. My dad got us a group rate. Only $4,999 each. We'll be rubbing elbows with tech investors, college recruiters, and industry leaders. It's a 10-day cruise through the Caribbean. Think about the college essays we can write about this. Think about the connections. In my past life, I had stood up. I had been the logical one, the class president, the buzzkill. I had pointed out that $4,999 was an astronomical sum for a high school trip that wasn't sanctioned by the district. More importantly, I had pointed out the fatal flaw in her plan. The cruise dates overlapped perfectly with the state's unified college application deadline. I had reported the unofficial trip to the principal out of a genuine desire to protect my classmates from throwing their money away and missing their shot at university. My reward, Serena twisted the narrative. She cried in the hallway, telling everyone I was a jealous, vindictive loser who wanted to ruin their futures because I was too poor to afford the ticket. The class turned on me like a pack of starving dogs. Derek Serena's aggressive shadow had cornered me in the locker room. They planted stolen answer keys in my backpack. I was expelled. My college offers vanished. My parents bankrupted themselves, fighting the legal battles Serena's wealthy father threw at us. I died a decade later, working double shifts at a warehouse, entirely alone, my heart giving out from stress. They went on to live their lives completely unbothered by the corpse they stepped over to get there. "So," Serena said, clapping her hands together, pulling me back to the present. "Who is in?" Derek was the first to shoot his hand up. "Hell yes. I'm not missing out on this. Put me down for a VIP cabin." A chorus of excited chatter erupted. Kids were already pulling out their phones, texting their parents, buzzing with the manufactured FOMO Serena was expertly dealing out. I looked at them. Really, looked at them. Jenna, who sat 2 rows over, was biting her nails calculating how many shifts she'd have to work at the diner to afford it. Toby, the quiet kid in the back, was looking at Serena with pure adoration, already pulling out his wallet. My chest tightened. The ghost of my past life's righteous indignation flared up. The words were right there on my tongue. The application portal closes on October 20th. You won't have internet access on the ship. The basic package doesn't include Wi-Fi. It's a scam. I swallowed the words. They tasted like ash. I remembered the cold concrete of the locker room floor. I remembered the look of pure disgust on Serena's face when I was escorted off campus. Liam, I looked up. Serena was staring directly at me. The room went quiet. They all knew I was the pragmatic one. They expected me to argue. Derek leaned back in his chair, crossing his massive arms, a sneer already forming on his lips, daring me to speak. "What do you think, Liam?" Serena asked, her voice laced with a subtle mocking challenge. "You going to lecture us on fiscal responsibility again?" A slow, foreign smile stretched across my face. It felt strange. It wasn't my usual smile. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I think it sounds incredible. You're right, Serena. An opportunity like that. You guys would be crazy to miss it." Serena blinked, her perfect mask slipping for a fraction of a second, in sheer surprise. Derek uncrossed his arms, looking slightly disappointed that he didn't get to berate me. "Really?" Serena asked, narrowing her eyes. "Absolutely," I lied, leaning back in my chair. "I mean, college recruiters on a luxury cruise. That's a once-in-a-lifetime deal. Everyone who can go definitely should." The tension in the room evaporated instantly. If even Liam, the resident cynic, thought it was a good idea, it had to be gold. The chatter doubled in volume. I turned my attention to the window. Outside, the autumn leaves were just starting to turn brown. They were going to fall soon. All of them. And this time, I wasn't going to stand at the bottom of the tree trying to catch them. Over the next 2 weeks, the classroom transformed from an educational environment into a hysterical, cult-like travel agency. The $4,999 price tag was a brutal filter, but Serena knew exactly how to manipulate the desperate high school psyche. She didn't sell a vacation. She sold a ticket to the upper class. She promised exclusive letters of recommendation from the investors who were supposedly vacationing on the ship. She promised sunset yacht parties that would make their Instagram accounts look like celebrity feeds. I watched the madness unfold with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an ant farm on a hot stove. During lunch on a Tuesday, I sat at my usual corner table in the cafeteria. The air was thick with the smell of fried food and teenage anxiety. A heavy hand slammed down on my tray, making my milk carton jump. I looked up to see Derek. He was wearing a tight athletic shirt, his jaw clenched, radiating unearned superiority. "Hey, broke boy," Derek sneered, leaning over the table. "Haven't seen your deposit yet. Serena's closing the list on Friday." I took a slow bite of my sandwich, chewing methodically before swallowing. "I'm not going, Derek." Derek laughed, a loud barking sound that drew the attention of the surrounding tables. Jenna and a few others from our homeroom turned to watch. "Figured," Derek said loudly, playing to his audience. "Couldn't scrape the pennies together. Man, it's going to suck for you. We're all going to come back with guaranteed admissions to state, and you're going to be stuck here flipping burgers." Serena said her dad's friend is the dean of admissions at Crestview. He's on the boat. It was a blatant lie. A microscopic amount of research would reveal that the dean of admissions at Crestview University was a 60-year-old woman who notoriously hated travel, but no one checked. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the fantasy. "I guess I'll just have to take my chances," I said evenly. I didn't give him the anger he was fishing for. I gave him nothing. Derek scoffed, kicking the leg of my chair as he walked away. "Enjoy staying behind, loser." I watched him go. I felt a brief, sharp pang of pity when I looked over at Jenna. She was on her phone, her voice a strained, desperate whisper. "Mom, please," Jenna was saying, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't understand. If I don't go on this, my life is literally over. Everyone is going. They're getting recommendation letters. We can take it out of my college fund. Just advance it to me." She was destroying her own safety net to buy a ticket on the Titanic. I looked away. I couldn't save them. I had tried that once. Later that afternoon, the reality of the impending deadline briefly reared its head. Mr. Harrison, our tired, overworked guidance counselor, walked into homeroom. He looked like a man who had entirely given up on life, his tie loose, carrying a stack of thick envelopes. "All right, listen up," Mr. Harrison said, his voice barely cutting through the excited chatter about swimsuit diets and passport renewals. "Quiet down." The room fell to a murmur. The State Unified Application Portal closes on October 20th at exactly 11:59 p.m. Mr. Harrison said, tapping the chalkboard. "Do not wait until the last minute. The servers always crash. You need your essays uploaded, your transcripts verified, and your fee waivers processed." He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on Serena. "I understand a lot of you are going on this trip. You leave on the 14th and return on the 24th. That means you will be at sea during the deadline." Panic rippled through the room. A few kids looked at Serena, their eyes wide with sudden doubt. Serena rolled her eyes, standing up with an air of practiced exasperation. "Mr. Harrison, relax. It's a luxury cruise line. We have satellite Wi-Fi. We're actually planning a submission party by the pool on the 18th. We're all going to log on together and hit submit with mocktails in our hands. It'll be iconic." The doubt vanished instantly. The class cheered. A submission party by the pool. It sounded so glamorous. Mr. Harrison sighed, rubbing his temples. "I strongly advise against relying on cruise ship internet for a secure connection to a state database. But you're legally adults in the eyes of the system now. It's your responsibility." "We've got it handled," Derek shouted from the back. "Don't sweat it, Harrison." I kept my head down, staring at my own meticulously organized application folder. I had read the terms and conditions of the Oceanic Vanguard. The $4,999 package was the base tier. It covered food in a windowless cabin on the lower decks. Satellite Wi-Fi was an additional $300 a day, and the bandwidth was capped at 128 kilobits per second, barely enough to send a text message, let alone upload heavy PDF files through a secure encrypted state firewall. Furthermore, on the 19th and 20th, the ship's itinerary placed it straight through a dead zone in international waters. 30 kids in my class were about to sail straight into a digital void during the most critical 48 hours of their academic lives. I ran my thumb over the edge of my transcript. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't guilt. It was anticipation. October 14th arrived with a suffocating, muggy heat. The school parking lot was entirely taken over by two massive, idling luxury coaches. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and overwhelming excitement. I stood by the chain-link fence at the edge of the campus, holding a single, worn backpack. The school was virtually empty. Only a handful of us, the ones who couldn't afford the ticket, or the ones who actually had some common sense, remained behind. Serena was holding court by the door of the first bus. She was dressed like a reality TV star, dodging paparazzi, oversized designer sunglasses, a wide-brimmed straw hat, and a pristine white linen outfit that would inevitably get ruined the second she spilled a drink on it. Parents were snapping photos. Kids were screaming, hugging, dragging oversized suitcases with broken wheels across the asphalt. "Hey, Liam." I turned. Serena was waving at me from the steps of the bus. She broke away from her crowd and walked over to the fence. Even now, at the absolute peak of her triumph, she couldn't resist twisting the knife. She needed total victory. She needed me to feel small. "We're about to head out," she said, leaning against the fence. She lowered her sunglasses, looking at me with a mixture of faux pity and deep satisfaction. "It's really too bad you couldn't make it work. I asked my dad if we could sponsor you, but you know it's a liability thing." It was a lie, of course. She wanted me here, standing in the dust, watching her leave. "Have a good time, Serena," I said, my voice completely flat. "Make sure you get those applications in." She laughed, a bright, tinkling sound. "Oh, don't worry about us. We're going to be fine. Try not to die of boredom while we're gone." She turned and walked back to the bus, her followers parting like the Red Sea to let her board. Derek gave me a middle finger from the back window as the bus doors hissed shut. The engines roared. The air brakes released with a loud sigh. Slowly, the two massive buses pulled out of the parking lot, taking 30 of my classmates toward the coast. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rumble of the engines fade into the distance. The silence that settled over the school was profound. It was the silence of a bomb successfully diffused. Or rather, a bomb I had successfully moved to another room. I turned my back on the empty parking lot and walked straight to the school library. It was dead quiet inside. The librarian didn't even look up as I sat down at one of the desktop computers in the back corner. I pulled out my folder. I laid my essay, my transcripts, and my letters of recommendation on the desk. I opened the State Unified Portal. Even now, 6 days before the deadline, the server was sluggish. The little blue wheel spun and spun, testing my patience. I breathed in, keeping my heart rate steady. I typed in my credentials. Upload, document 1 personal statement. Click, wait, spin. Uploaded successfully. Upload document 2, official transcript. Click, wait, spin. Uploaded successfully. I worked methodically. There was no rush, no panic. I had all the time in the world. When I reached the final screen, a large green button pulsed gently at the bottom of the monitor. Submit, application. I pressed it. A confirmation window popped up, accompanied by an automated email pinging my phone. Your application has been received and locked. No further edits can be made. I leaned back in the cheap plastic chair, staring at the screen. A massive weight, one I had been carrying since the moment I woke up in this timeline, lifted off my chest. My future was secure. The next 6 days moved with agonizing slowness. I attended half-empty classes. The teachers largely gave up on actual instruction, putting on movies, or letting us use the time as study halls. At home, I tracked the Oceanic Vanguard online. I bookmarked a maritime tracking website that updated the ship's coordinates every hour. For the first 3 days, my social media feeds were entirely unusable, choked with a relentless barrage of photos. Serena by the pool, Derek holding an incredibly expensive-looking drink, Jenna posing on the sun deck, looking sunburned, but desperate to appear happy. The captions were all variations of the same delusion. Networking hashtag future CEOs. Hashtag Crestview bound. Then, on the 18th, 2 days before the deadline, the ship entered the deep waters of the Caribbean. The tracking dot on my screen moved outside the coverage zone. My feed went completely, utterly silent. Not a single photo, not a single tweet, not a single update. They had hit the dead zone. October 20th arrived, the day of the deadline. I spent the evening in my bedroom, staring at the digital clock on my nightstand. The state portal website was open on my laptop. As predicted by Mr. Harrison, the site was currently displaying a massive red banner warning high traffic volume. Expect delays of up to 45 minutes for uploads. If you were sitting in a house with gigabit fiber optic internet, it was a frustrating wait. If you were sitting on a boat in the middle of the ocean, relying on a throttled shared satellite connection that cut out every time a cloud passed over, it was a death sentence. 10 p.m. I imagined the scene on the ship. The pool deck cold and windy in the dark. 30 teenagers, frantically refreshing their browsers on their phones, the little loading bars freezing at 1%. 11 p.m. The panic would be setting in now. Serena's practiced smile would be cracking. Derek would be threatening the ship's concierge, demanding they turn the Wi-Fi up, not understanding that physics didn't care about his anger. Jenna would be crying, realizing the money she stole from her own future bought her a front row seat to her own ruin. 11:50 p.m. 10 minutes left. The state portal crashed entirely for 3 minutes before coming back online slower than ever. 11:58 p.m. I watched the seconds tick by on my clock. 11:59 p.m. Midnight. The red banner on the state portal website vanished. It was replaced by a clean, stark gray screen with a single line of black text. The 2026 Unified State College Application Portal is now closed. No late submissions will be accepted under any circumstances. Thank you. I closed my laptop. The room was dark, save for the ambient streetlight filtering through the blinds. I didn't cheer. I didn't laugh. I just sat there, in the quiet dark, feeling the cold, hard reality of consequence settle over the world. 30 futures, gone in the blink of an eye, and they had paid $4,999 for the privilege. The buses returned on a damp gray Tuesday. The vibrant autumn leaves that had framed their departure were now plastered flat against the wet asphalt. I stood by the second-floor library window, looking down at the parking lot. They didn't look like future CEOs. They looked like refugees from a failed music festival. When the pneumatic doors hissed open, there was no cheering, no laughing. The suffocating silence practically radiated through the glass pane of the window. Toby was the first one off. His shoulders were hunched by his ears, his face a pale pasty contrast to the angry red sunburn peeling on his nose. He dragged his suitcase behind him, the broken wheel scraping a harsh, rhythmic protest against the concrete. He didn't look up. He just kept walking, staring intensely at the ground. Then came Jenna. She was crying. It wasn't the loud theatrical sobbing of a teenager who had lost a phone or suffered a breakup. It was a silent, hyperventilating panic. She gripped her phone in both hands, her thumbs frantically swiping at the screen over and over again, as if reloading the page enough times would somehow reverse the flow of time. Slowly, the rest of the class spilled out onto the pavement. The swagger was gone. The manufactured superiority had evaporated in the salty Caribbean air. They had hit cell towers about 50 miles out from the port. That was when their phones had finally connected to a stable 5G network. That was when 30 synchronized automated emails hit their inboxes, informing them that their incomplete drafts had been purged from the unified state system. Following the October 20th deadline, Serena descended the steps of the first bus. She was trying desperately to maintain the facade. She still wore the designer sunglasses, though the sky was overcast and miserable. Her jaw was locked tight. She walked with stiff, jerky movements, flanked by a few girls who looked completely hollowed out. Derek stormed off the bus right behind her. He shoved past a smaller kid, his massive frame vibrating with unfiltered rage. He wasn't carrying a suitcase. He had left it in the luggage bay. He stomped straight toward Serena, grabbing her by the shoulder and spinning her around. Even through the thick, double-paned glass of the library, I could see the violence in his body language. He pointed a thick finger directly into her face. Serena slapped his hand away her mouth, moving rapidly, her chin tilted up in a defensive, haughty posture. She was deflecting. I knew her playbook intimately. She was telling him it wasn't her fault, that the ship's itinerary had changed, that the portal servers were garbage, that her father would fix it. I watched Derek's face contort. In my past life, that exact expression of blind, unreasoning fury had been directed at me. He had shoved me into a row of metal lockers. He had ruined my reputation to protect his own bruised ego. Now, the monster Serena had fed and kept as a pet was turning its teeth on her. The library door clicked open behind me. Mr. Harrison walked in. He smelled like cheap drip coffee and profound exhaustion. He stopped next to me, looking out the window at the parking lot drama below. We stood in silence for a long time, watching Derek scream at Serena, while the rest of the class stood paralyzed in the freezing drizzle. "I tried to tell them, Liam," Mr. Harrison said quietly. His voice was scraped raw, lacking any of the usual bureaucratic distance. "I stood in that classroom, and I told them the dates." "You did?" I agreed, my voice perfectly level. "The school board is going to want a scapegoat," he muttered, rubbing his eyes beneath his glasses. "The principal has been fielding calls from the harbor since 6 a.m. Parents screaming about lawsuits, demanding we reopen the portal." "You can't," I said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Harrison let out a dry, humorless bark of a laugh. "Reopen the state portal. I'm a high school guidance counselor. I barely have the clearance to reset a student's email password. The governor's office manages that database. It's locked tight until the spring transfer window. They missed it. They all missed it." Down in the parking lot, Jenna dropped her phone. The screen shattered on the wet concrete. She didn't bend down to pick it up. She just stood there, staring at the broken glass, her hands covering her face. My chest felt hollow, but it wasn't from sympathy. It was the absolute absence of the crushing suicidal despair I had carried in my past life. I felt nothing for them. I felt only the solid, unyielding reality of consequence. "It's a hard lesson," I said. Mr. Harrison looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. He probably expected me to gloat, or at least show some shock. "You didn't go." "I couldn't afford it," I lied smoothly. "Besides, I wanted to make sure my application was in." "Good," he said, turning away from the window. "Someone had to have some sense. Go to class, Liam. The hallways are going to be a bloodbath today." I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door. As I stepped out into the corridor, the first wave of returning students pushed through the main double doors. The The smell of coconut sunscreen and stale sweat hit the stagnant, heated air of the school. I kept my head up. I walked straight through the middle of them. They parted from me without even realizing it, too consumed by their own unraveling lives to notice the kid they had tried to step on. I didn't look back. By Wednesday, the high school had been transformed into a localized war zone. The principal's office was essentially under siege. The waiting area, usually occupied by kids, caught vaping in the bathrooms, was packed shoulder to shoulder with enraged, wealthy parents in business attire. I had a free period before lunch, so I sat on a bench near the administration wing, pretending to read a history textbook. In reality, I was soaking in the carnage. Serena's father, Richard, was currently the loudest voice in the room. He was a towering man in a bespoke charcoal suit, his face flushed a dangerous shade of magenta. He was pacing the small administrative lobby, gesturing wildly at Principal Higgins, a small, weary woman who looked like she was actively praying for early retirement. "This is unacceptable, Higgins." Richard's voice boomed through the thin drywall. "My daughter has a 4.1 GPA. She is the captain of the debate team. You are going to pick up that phone. You are going to call the state education board. And you are going to tell them, there was a technical error on your end. Mr. Davis." Principal Higgins set her voice tight with strained patience. "There was no technical error on our end. The school's Wi-Fi was functioning perfectly. Your daughter and 29 other students were on a cruise ship in international waters. They failed to submit their applications." The ship's Wi-Fi failed. Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the reception desk. The secretary jumped. "We paid for a premium networking package. The service went down during a crucial window. We are preparing a class action lawsuit against Oceanic Vanguard. But in the meantime, you need to grant these kids an extension. I do not have the power to override the state government." Richard Higgins snapped, finally losing her professional veneer. "The portal is an automated system. It locked at midnight on the 20th. I couldn't open it if my own job depended on it. They missed the deadline. They will have to wait for the late admission cycle in the spring or apply to community colleges that have rolling admissions." The words, "community college," dropped into the room like a live grenade. Serena, who was sitting in a plastic chair near the wall, let out a sharp, choked gasp. She looked entirely broken. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot, and she was wearing a generic gray hoodie, a far cry from her usual designer wardrobe. The illusion of her untouchable status had been shattered. Community college. Richard spat the words as if they tasted like poison. "My daughter is a legacy at Crestview. She is not going to a community college because of an IT glitch. Then she can take a gap year and apply next fall," Higgins said firmly. "I am sorry, Mr. Davis, but this is the reality of the situation." I slowly turned a page in my textbook. The satisfaction washing over me was a cold, pure current. In my past life, Richard Davis had sat in that exact office and threatened to ruin my parents financially if I didn't drop my slanderous accusations against his daughter. He had used his wealth as a blunt instrument to crush the truth. Now, all his money, all his bespoke suits, and aggressive posturing were entirely useless against an unfeeling automated state server. You can't bribe a line of code. Down the hallway, the fallout among the students was getting physical. I watched Derek corner Jenna near the water fountain. Derek had banked his entire future on a football scholarship to a Division II state school. The scholarship was contingent on his formal application being processed through the unified portal. Without it, the athletic department couldn't officially offer him the roster spot. "You told me it was going to work," Derek was yelling, leaning over Jenna. "You said Serena had it figured out." "I didn't know," Jenna cried, backing away until her shoulders hit the tiled wall. "I lost my spot too. Derek, I drained my college fund for that ticket." "I don't care about your stupid fund," Derek roared, slamming his fist into the metal casing of the water fountain. A loud, echoing clang rang down the hall. "I lost my full ride. My dad is going to kill me. He's literally going to throw me out of the house." Other students were stopping pulling out their phones, recording the meltdown. The Oceanic Networking Group was cannibalizing itself in real time. Serena walked out of the principal's office just as Derek turned away from the dented water fountain. They locked eyes. The hallway went completely silent. Every phone was pointed at them. "Derek," Serena started, her voice trembling. She took a step toward him, raising a hand in a placating gesture. "My dad is calling the governor's office. We're going to get an injunction. Just calm down." Derek didn't calm down. He closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. He didn't hit her. Even he wasn't that stupid with 20 cameras rolling. But he stopped inches from her face, his chest heaving. "You owe me $80,000 in tuition." Derek said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, gravelly whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet hallway. "You and your dad, you promised us recruiters. There were no recruiters on that boat. There were just old people in a broken satellite dish. You lied to us." "I didn't lie," Serena shrieked, her composed facade finally shattering into absolute hysteria. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup. "I wanted a good trip. I wanted us to have an advantage. You didn't have to come. You sold us a scam." Derek spat. He stepped back, looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You're pathetic." He turned and walked away, shouldering his way through the crowd. Serena stood alone in the middle of the hallway, sobbing openly, surrounded by a ring of her former followers, who now looked at her like she was radioactive. No one stepped forward to comfort her. No one offered her a tissue. I closed my history textbook. The bell for lunch rang a loud, sharp trill that broke the spell. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Serena alone in the corridor. I stood up from the bench, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and walked past her. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a sarcastic remark. I just walked right by, ignoring her completely, letting her drown in the ocean she had built for herself. Mid-November arrived, with biting frost and a mercilessly gray sky. The atmosphere in the high school had permanently shifted. The senior class, usually buzzing with the frantic energy of impending freedom, felt like a funeral procession. The divide between the 30 kids who went on the cruise and the rest of us was a physical barrier. They sat in the back of the classrooms, quiet, sullen, and hollow. The frantic attempts to find a loophole had failed. The lawsuits filed by Richard Davis and a coalition of angry parents had been thrown out by a judge who pointedly noted that a luxury cruise did not constitute an unforeseen act of God that warranted bypassing state deadlines. They were stuck. The reality of community college gap years, working retail, and vanished scholarships had finally settled into their bones. It was a Tuesday morning during homeroom when Mr. Harrison walked in. He wasn't carrying a stack of bad news this time. He was carrying a single, heavy envelope. The room went quiet as he walked down the aisle. He stopped at my desk. "Came in the morning mail run," Mr. Harrison said, dropping the thick, cream-colored envelope onto my desk. The return address was embossed in dark blue ink. Crestview University, Office of Early Admissions. A thick envelope meant an acceptance packet. A thin envelope meant a rejection letter. Every eye in the room locked onto my desk. I looked at the envelope. In my past life, I had never even gotten the chance to receive a rejection letter. My application had been withdrawn by the school board after the cheating allegations Serena orchestrated. I had watched my parents weep at the kitchen table, drowning in legal fees, while Serena posted photos of her Crestview acceptance on Instagram. I picked up the envelope. It was heavy. It contained a brochure, a housing application, and a welcome letter. I didn't tear it open frantically. I just slid my thumb neatly under the flap, breaking the seal with a quiet, satisfying rip. I pulled out the top sheet of paper. "Dear Liam, congratulations. On behalf of the admissions committee, I am thrilled to offer you a place in the incoming freshman class." I read the words twice to make sure they were real. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. I folded the letter, slid it back into the thick envelope, and slipped it into my backpack. "Good news?" Mr. Harrison asked gently. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Crestview, full academic scholarship." The words hung in the air of the silent classroom. 2 rows over, Jenna put her head down on her desk, her shoulders shaking silently. She had wanted to go to Crestview. She had the grades for it, but she was currently working 5 shifts a week at a diner off the highway to pay back her parents for the $4,999 she had thrown into the ocean. In the front row, Serena sat perfectly rigid. She was staring straight ahead at the chalkboard, her knuckles white as she gripped a pencil. Crestview was her legacy school. Her grandfather's name was on a library wing. She had spent the last 3 years curating her entire personality around going to that school. Now, she was going to spend next year sitting on her parents' couch, trying to explain to her mother's country club friends why she was taking a gap year to find herself, while the kid she had always looked down on walked the campus she thought belonged to her. Toby, sitting in the back, just stared out the window, completely dead-eyed. "Congratulations, Liam," Mr. Harrison said, giving my shoulder a brief solid squeeze. "You earned it." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," I replied. The bell rang for first period. The students stood up, shuffling out of the room like zombies. There was no chatter. No one congratulated me. They couldn't stomach it. My success was a massive, flashing neon sign pointing directly at their colossal failure. I took my time packing up my bag. Serena was the last one to leave the room. She lingered near the door, her fingers tracing the metal frame. She looked back at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, devoid of the arrogant spark that used to define her. "You knew," Serena whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken. "When you told me it was a good idea, you knew we wouldn't have Wi-Fi." I zipped my backpack and slung it over my shoulder. I walked toward the door, stopping just a foot away from her. I looked down at her. "I told you the application date's Serena," I said, my tone devoid of anger, devoid of pity. I spoke to her like a bank teller explaining an overdrawn account. I told the whole class, "You chose to believe a luxury brochure over basic logistics because you wanted to feel elite. You didn't just buy a ticket. You bought your own delusion. You could have stopped us." She said, a tear finally spilling over her lashes. You could have warned us again." "I did," I said. "And you didn't listen. Enjoy your gap year." I stepped past her, walking out into the crowded hallway. I didn't look back to see if she was still crying. I didn't care. I pushed through the double doors at the end of the hall, stepping out into the cold, crisp November air. The sky was gray, but the biting wind felt incredibly clean. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the reality of a future that finally belonged to me. The slate was wiped clean. The debt of my past life was paid in full. I walked down the concrete steps, heading toward my next class, leaving the ghosts of their ruined futures exactly where they belonged behind me. January rolled into town like a slow-moving glacier. It froze the slush on the sidewalks into jagged, dirty ice and settled a permanent biting chill over the high school. The initial shock of the October deadline had worn off, replaced by a deep, suffocating financial hangover. The $4,999 price tag of the Oceanic Vanguard had been a stretch for many families. It was pitched as an investment. Now it was just a massive hole in their bank accounts. The local paper, usually dedicated to high school sports and town council zoning disputes, picked up the story of Richard Davis's lawsuit. It wasn't the heroic crusade Richard had envisioned. The article detailed how 30 families were suing a luxury cruise line because their children failed to submit online applications while vacationing in international waters. The town tore them apart. The letters to the editor were brutal. Working-class parents who had spent their autumns helping their kids navigate fee waivers and financial aid forms had zero sympathy for the cruise kids. The public humiliation stripped away the last remnants of Serena's social armor. She stopped eating in the cafeteria. She stopped speaking in class. She became a ghost, haunting the hallways, wearing oversized coats, and keeping her eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. I saw the real cost of it on a Tuesday night. I was driving home from the library, the heater in my beat-up sedan, struggling against the sub-zero temperatures. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner off the interstate to grab a coffee. The neon sign buzzed erratically, casting long, harsh red shadows across the wet asphalt. The bell above the door jingled. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and harsh industrial sanitizer. Jenna was behind the counter. She wore a faded pink uniform that was a size too big, a greased-stained apron tied tightly around her waist. She was vigorously wiping down a laminated menu, her hands red and chapped from the hot dishwater. When she heard the bell, she looked up, slapping on a practiced, exhausted customer service smile. The smile died the second she saw me. We stared at each other across the empty diner. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerators and the faint crackle of the radio in the kitchen, playing a muted country song. "Liam," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the frantic energy that used to define her. "Hey, Jenna, just a black coffee to go, please." She nodded silently, turning to the heavy coffee urns. I watched her work. In my past life, Jenna had gone to a decent state school, joined a sorority, and completely ignored the fact that my life had been destroyed to protect her friend group. Now she was working the graveyard shift on a Tuesday. She put the cardboard cup on the counter and snapped a plastic lid over it. $2. I handed her a $5 bill. "Keep it." She looked at the money, then pushed it back across the laminate counter. "I don't need your charity, Liam." "It's a tip, Jenna, for the coffee." She let out a sharp, bitter exhale, taking the $5 and dropping 3 ones onto the counter. Just take your change. I picked up the dollar bills. I didn't want to drag this out, but as I turned toward the door, she spoke again. Derek got arrested, she said to the empty room. I stopped my hand, hovering over the cold metal handle of the door. I looked back over my shoulder. Jenna was leaning heavily against the counter, staring at the coffee urns. Last weekend, he got into a fight behind the movie theater, put a kid from Oak Creek in the hospital. His dad kicked him out. He's sleeping on Toby's basement couch. The anger that had fueled Derek's entire existence had finally found a target he couldn't bully his way out of. Without his football scholarship, he was just another angry guy with heavy hands and no prospects. The police didn't care about his high school rushing yards. I'm sorry, I said. And strangely, I meant it. Not enough to change what I did, but enough to recognize the tragedy of it. Jenna looked at me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. You knew, didn't you? When you sat in homeroom and told Serena it was a great idea, you knew what was going to happen. I knew the deadline was October 20th. I replied evenly, the warm paper cup heating my palm. I knew the ship didn't have reliable internet. I didn't make you buy a ticket, Jenna. I didn't force you to take money from your college fund. A tear tracked through the faint dusting of makeup on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. I was so stupid. We were all so stupid. We just wanted to be like her. We wanted to feel important. And now you know what it costs, I said gently. Take care of yourself, Jenna. I walked out into the freezing night. The wind bit through my jacket, but I felt incredibly warm. I got into my car, placing the coffee in the cup holder. I watched Jenna through the diner window for a moment. She was back to wiping down the menus, scrubbing at a stain that wouldn't come out. The winter ground on. The local judge formally dismissed Richard Davis's lawsuit with prejudice in late February, citing a complete lack of legal standing. The Davis family had to pay the cruise line's legal fees. Rumors swirled that Richard was leveraging his house to cover the costs and the business losses he suffered from the bad PR. They had built a fortress out of arrogance, and an automated server had reduced it to rubble. Spring brought a cruel, mocking beauty to the town. The snow melted the trees, budded, and the high school geared up for the most anticipated day of the senior year college declaration day. It was a tradition. On the first Friday of May, every senior was supposed to come to school wearing a hoodie t-shirt or hat representing the university they would be attending in the fall. In previous years, the hallways were a riot of colors, crimson, navy, gold, as kids celebrated the culmination of 12 years of public education. This year, the silence in the hallways was deafening. I walked through the front doors wearing a crisp, dark blue Crestview University hoodie. It felt heavy and substantial. I didn't swagger. I didn't point it out. I just wore it. The visual divide in the senior class was stark and deeply uncomfortable. About half the class, the ones who had stayed behind, wore their varied college colors. They clustered by the lockers, talking in hushed, excited tones about dorm assignments and meal plans. The other half, the 30 who sailed on the Oceanic Vanguard, wore plain, unbranded clothes. They looked like background extras in a movie about someone else's life. Toby was wearing a faded gray zip-up. Jenna wore a plain black sweater. Derek wasn't there at all. He had officially dropped out in March to take a full-time landscaping job to pay his legal fees. I walked past Serena by the water fountain. She was wearing a plain white blouse. Her blonde hair, usually perfectly styled, was pulled into a tight, severe ponytail. She saw my Crestview hoodie. I saw her eyes track the logo, stitched across my chest, A muscle feathered in her jaw, but she immediately looked away, staring intensely at the bulletin board. There was no confrontation. There was no screaming. That was the most brutal part of the reality they were living. The anger had burned out, leaving nothing but a vast, empty expanse of regret. Graduation rehearsal began in early June. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and teenage sweat. Mr. Harrison stood at the podium, a microphone squealing with feedback, trying to organize 200 restless kids into alphabetical order. "Listen up," Mr. Harrison's voice echoed off the rafters. "When they call your name, you walk across the stage, take the diploma cover with your left hand, shake the principal's hand with your right. Do not trip. Do not take a selfie on the stage." We lined up. I stood between a girl named Sarah, who was heading to state college for nursing, and a guy named Mike, who was enlisting in the Navy. I looked down the line. I saw the cruise kids interspersed throughout the alphabet. They went through the motions with a mechanical, lifeless compliance. This ceremony wasn't a launch pad for them. It was an eviction notice. They were being pushed out of the only structured environment they had ever known, straight into a void. Graduation day arrived, with a punishing humid heat. The football field was covered in rows of white folding chairs. Parents packed the bleachers, fanning themselves with the ceremonial programs. The high school band played a slightly off-key rendition of Pomp and Circumstance. We marched out in our cheap, polyester royal blue gowns. The synthetic fabric clung to my back, trapping the heat. I took my seat near the front. The speeches were exactly what you would expect. The class valedictorian talked about the boundless horizon and taking the world by storm. Principal Higgins gave a weary speech about resilience and community. Every word of optimism felt like a physical blow to the kids sitting behind me. Liam Gallagher, my name boomed over the PA system. The applause from the bleachers was polite and steady. I stood up, adjusting the tassel on my cap. I walked up the wooden steps of the temporary stage. The plywood groaned slightly under my weight. Principal Higgins was waiting at the center. She actually smiled at me. It was a genuine, tired smile. "Congratulations, Liam," she murmured, handing me the padded leather diploma cover. "Crestview is lucky to have you." "Thank you, Principal Higgins," I said. I shook her hand, looking out over the sea of blue caps and gowns. I didn't see my classmates. I saw my past life. I saw the ghost of the boy who had been expelled, who had watched this ceremony from the chain-link fence outside the stadium, his heart filled with an acidic, consuming hatred. That boy was dead. He had died on a warehouse floor 10 years from now. I was someone else, entirely. I walked down the steps and returned to my seat. 20 minutes later, they called Serena Davis. The applause from the bleachers was noticeably thin. Her parents were sitting in the front row. Richard Davis wasn't wearing a bespoke suit. He looked haggard, his posture slumped. He held up a smartphone to record his daughter, but there was no pride in his face, only a grim endurance. Serena walked across the stage. She held her head high, a desperate, fragile attempt to project the superiority she had lost. But as she reached for the diploma cover, she fumbled. The leather folder slipped from Principal Higgins's grasp and hit the plywood stage with a dull thud. A collective sympathetic gasp rippled through the front rows. Serena froze. She stared down at the diploma cover. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. It was a perfect, terrible metaphor for her entire year. She had reached for her prize, and it had slipped right through her fingers. She bent down her face, flushing violently crimson, and snatched it off the floor. She didn't shake Higgins's hand. She practically ran off the stage, her blue gown billowing behind her. When the ceremony ended, we were instructed to move our tassels from right to left. "Congratulations, class of 2026, Mr. Harrison shouted into the microphone. Caps flew into the air, a scattered, uncoordinated burst of blue against the hazy summer sky. People cheered. Families rushed the field, carrying bouquets of grocery store flowers and Mylar balloons. I found my parents near the 50-yard line. They hugged me tight. They were ordinary people, a mechanic and a substitute teacher. They didn't have offshore accounts or legacy connections. But they had me, and I was going to Crestview on a full ride. That was enough. I looked over my mother's shoulder. Through the crowd, I saw the cruise kids finding their parents. There were forced smiles. There were quick, tight hugs. But there was no joy. They were holding their empty diploma covers, looking around at the football field, as if they had just woken up from a dream to find themselves standing in a desert. The party was over. The bill had come due. Late August arrived, painting the town in dry, golden hues. The air smelled of cut grass and hot asphalt. My bedroom was reduced to a series of cardboard boxes. The posters were off the walls, leaving behind slightly discolored squares of paint. The desk, where I had meticulously planned my revenge, and my future, was bare. I taped the last box shut, running my hand over the smooth, brown cardboard. "You got everything," my dad called from the hallway. "Yeah," I shouted back. "Just need to load the car." It took 20 minutes to cram my life into the trunk and back seat of my old sedan. My mom stood in the driveway, crying softly into a tissue. It wasn't the frantic, terrified crying of a mother watching her son's life unravel. It was the good kind of crying, the kind that comes when you realize your kid is going to be okay. I hugged them both. It was a long, grounding embrace. "Drive safe," my dad said, patting the roof of the car. "Call us when you get to the dorm." "I will." I slid into the driver's seat, the vinyl hot against my back. I rolled down the windows, put the car in reverse, and backed out of the driveway. I didn't look back as I shifted into drive and headed down the quiet suburban street. The drive to the interstate took me straight through the center of town. I passed the high school, its brick facade looking small and insignificant in the summer glare. I passed the local park empty in the midday heat. My gas gauge was hovering near a quarter tank, so I pulled into the massive gas station complex on the edge of town, right before the highway on-ramp. The heat radiating off the concrete was visible, distorting the air in shimmering waves. I parked at pump number 4, popped the fuel door, and got out. The smell of gasoline and hot dust filled my lungs. I slid my debit card into the reader and selected regular unleaded. While the pump was running, I walked toward the convenience store attached to the station to grab a bottle of water. The automatic doors slid open, hitting me with a blast of over-conditioned, freezing air. I walked to the cooler in the back, grabbed a water, and turned toward the register. There was only one person working. She was wearing a shapeless, dark green polo shirt with the gas station's logo embroidered on the breast pocket. A beige visor, pulled low over her forehead, held back her blonde hair. She was meticulously arranging rows of lottery tickets beneath the glass counter, her movements robotic and slow. It was Serena. I stopped in the middle of the aisle, flanked by bags of potato chips and rows of motor oil. She looked up. The chime of the door must have registered late. Our eyes met. The silence in the store was absolute save for the low, vibrating hum of the commercial refrigerators. In my past life, Serena Davis was a god. She dictated who was worthy, who was acceptable, and who was garbage. She wielded her father's money like a broadsword, cutting down anyone who dared point out the truth. She had looked at me as an obstacle to be crushed. Now she was looking at me from behind the counter of a gas station on a Tuesday afternoon. Her face was pale. The arrogance was completely eradicated, replaced by a hollow, defeated exhaustion. The lawsuit had broken her father's finances. The ruined college application had broken her future. She didn't speak. She didn't look away either. She just stared at me, a silent acknowledgement of the vast, unbridgeable chasm that now separated our lives. I walked up to the counter. I set the cold bottle of water down on the rubber mat. She looked at the bottle, then looked at the cash register screen. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a second before she pressed the buttons. "$2.15, she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its musical, confident lilt. I pulled my wallet from my pocket, extracted a $5 bill, and handed it to her. She took it without brushing my fingers. The cash register popped open with a sharp, metallic ring. She counted out the change, 2 ones, and a handful of coins, and placed it on the counter. She didn't hand it to me. She couldn't bring herself to do it. I scooped up the change, dropped it into my pocket, and picked up the water. "Keep the line moving, Serena," I said quietly, not as an insult, just a simple factual statement of her new reality. She flinched slightly, her eyes dropping back to the lottery tickets under the glass. I turned and walked out of the store. The automatic doors slid shut behind me, cutting off the chill of the air conditioning. The summer heat hit me like a physical force. I walked back to my car. The pump had clicked off. I returned the nozzle to its holster, screwed the gas cap back on, and got into the driver's seat. I opened the bottle of water and took a long drink. It was freezing cold and tasted metallic, but it was exactly what I needed. I looked in the rearview mirror. Through the plate glass window of the gas station, I could see Serena. She had stopped arranging the lottery tickets. She was just standing behind the register, staring out at the hot, empty asphalt, trapped in a cage she had built with her own 2 hands. I put the car in gear. I pulled out of the gas station, the tires gripping the road. As I merged onto the highway, on-ramp, the radio kicked on, playing something upbeat and loud. I rolled the windows down, letting the hot, rushing wind fill the cabin. The speedometer climbed. 60, 70. The town fell away behind me, shrinking in the rearview mirror, until it was nothing more than a green blur against the horizon. There was no grand cinematic explosion. There was no triumphant villain monologue. There was just the highway stretching out in front of me, endlessly open, leading toward a future I had fought tooth and nail to secure. Revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about surviving them. It's about letting them tie their own noose while you simply walk away. I hit 75 miles an hour. I didn't look in the rearview mirror again. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly what was behind me. Nothing at all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a scream. It's the quiet sound of a car engine fading down the highway. They bought a luxury ticket to the top of the world, and all it cost them was their entire future. I didn't push them over the edge. I just watched them jump. If this story of rebirth and raw, unfiltered karma hit hard, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who knows exactly what it feels like to finally win. And make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories where the bullies finally get the bill. See you in the next one.